The onset of World War I brought with it demand for a wristwatch that could tell time in the dark. Such a tool would be a tactical advantage over the enemy, allowing for coordination of attacks at night without giving away infantry positions with lanterns or other light sources. The United States Radium Corporation, founded in 1917, offered a solution: a wristwatch that employed specially painted dials with hands that glowed in the dark. Over 95% of workers who painted the dials produced by the USRC were women, and they were taught that the most efficient way to form the camel hair brushes into a fine tip was to shape it with their lips. They were assured that this was perfectly safe. In fact, many girls would take to the luminescent properties of the paint so much that they would apply it to their skin before going out dancing at night. These workers came to be known as the Radium Girls, and what they didn't know was that with each brush stroke, they were doing permanent, irreversible damage to their bodies, and that many of them wouldn't live to see 30. After the discovery of radium and its luminous properties by Marie Curie and her husband Pierre in 1898, it was widely adopted in the form of luminous paint to allow time telling in the dark. Many factories were established across the United States and Canada that employed mostly women to paint these instruments. Since the area they were working on was on the microscopic level, they were told to form the bristles of their brushes to a fine tip using their lips. This was taught as a time-saving measure, as it was quicker than using other means. When dozens of women in the factory became ill, company president Arthur Roeder, fearing a scandal, contacted Professor Cecil Drinker at the Harvard School of Public Health to determine the cause of the illnesses. Drinker examined the factory and its employees, and what he found shocked him. He intended to go to the New Jersey Department of Labor with his report, but when Roeder discovered this, he threatened Drinker with a lawsuit. Roeder then submitted a forgery of the report, with Drinker's name on it, to the Labor Department. This false report found that every woman under the employ of USRC was in perfect health. Meanwhile, scientists who handled the radium began to take precautions such as masks, gloves, and screens. No changes were made regarding how the women of the factory painted the dials. The luminous paint used on the dials painted at the USRC was named Undark. The paint was composed of radium and zinc sulfide and was applied to the hands and indices of the watch dial. The alpha particles emitted by the radium continuously excite the phosphoric zinc sulfide, which causes the paint to emit a ghostly green glow in a process called radioluminescence. The alpha particles that trigger the luminescence are relatively harmless, being unable to penetrate even a sheet of paper. On the other hand, when they are introduced into the human body, they become extremely dangerous. Alpha particles emitted by radium are relatively slow-moving and heavy, which means they can cause intense ionizing damage to a very localized area. Ionizing radiation is dangerous because it possesses enough energy to break chemical bonds and strip electrons from atoms within living cells, causing damage to DNA. While cell damage varies based on particle type, dosage, and exposure time, in the case of acute radiation syndrome, cells cannot repair themselves and the damage is irreversible. Many of the women at the USRC were putting the radium-saturated brushes into their mouths dozens of times per dial and painting hundreds of dials per day. The radium would enter their system through their mouths and work its way through their body as it quietly destroyed everything in its path. As unwanted attention towards the USRC mounted, Arthur Roeder shifted blame away from his company as being responsible for his employees' condition and onto the employees themselves. He would state that syphilis was responsible for rampant illness in his company. The history of syphilis reaches back centuries, and the condition along with its associated symptoms is responsible for causing a great deal of fear in the public, especially in the United Kingdom and France. In 1864, the Contagious Disease Act was introduced as a hypothetical means to curb infection rates in soldiers and sailors. In practice, the bill allowed for the targeting, registration, arrest, and invasive medical examination of women. If found to be carrying syphilis, they would be confined to special medical institutions. Refusal to be examined was punishable by up to 6 months of hard labor in prison. The act required no such compliance by men. The act was finally repealed in 1886, but by then the psychic damage had already been done, and the stigma would remain deeply ingrained in society for decades. Professor Drinker's original report was unambiguous. The factory was saturated with radium-contaminated dust, and no steps had been taken for the women to protect them from it. Girls as young as 15 were being assured by supervisors that the radium was harmless, but Drinker was convinced that it was the cause of the illnesses in the factory. Syphilis had nothing to do with it, and Roeder's attempts to falsify Drinker's statement and smear the reputations of his own employees almost went unnoticed. The specific condition that affected the Radium Girls would become known as Radium Jaw. While the damage that the radium was doing to their internals was not confined to their mouths, it was where the damage was most visible. Toothache and bleeding gums were among the first signs. When the toothache progressed to the point of unbearable pain, the teeth were extracted. Somehow, the removal of the teeth only made matters worse as the wounds left behind refused to heal. This complicated matters, and necrosis of the jaw eventually set in, which was likewise excruciating. While this was happening in their mouths, the radium was also wreaking havoc on their internals. Radium belongs to the same family of metals as calcium, even having a similar chemical structure. Once in the bloodstream, radium mimics calcium's chemical behavior and is deposited into bone tissue by the body, which mistakes it for calcium. Once inside the bones, it is not easily removed. At this time, radium was still widely thought of as a miracle cure, and so there was no widely available treatments for this relatively unknown condition. After being threatened by the president of the USRC with legal action, Drinker backed down and did not bring his report to the Labor Department. Eventually, Alice Hamilton, his colleague at the Harvard School of Public Health, learned that the USRC was submitting a forgery of Drinker's report to the Department of Labor with his own name on it. After Hamilton alerted Drinker to what was going on, Drinker now had evidence in hand that Roeder had acted in bad faith and was trying to blackmail him to save his company's reputation. Drinker ignored the continued threat of lawsuit and published his original report anyway. This report would result in the Labor Department ruling that Drinker's safety recommendations be put in place. At this point, evidence was mounting that the president of the USRC had deliberately lied to his employees and tried to cover up evidence that the reason they were getting sick was a direct result of the work they were doing. Women were getting sick and dying. Autopsies were being conducted on them by USRC doctors who withheld the results from their families. The surviving dial painters were acutely aware that something was not right. While she wasn't the first woman to initiate litigation against USRC, Grace Fryer's lawsuit against the company would attract widespread attention and outrage. She had started working at USRC at age 18, spending 3 years there. Within 2 years of leaving, she started losing her teeth. Medical professionals discovered advanced bone decay in her jaw, but it wasn't until 1925 that a doctor suggested her previous employment may have been a factor. The statute of limitations at the time for workplace injury was 6 months. The radium sometimes took years to do its irreversible damage. This would not be an easy legal battle. It took 2 years to find an attorney who was willing to represent them, but in 1927, they found Raymond Barry. While the United States Radium Company denied wrongdoing, it wasn't convincing. By this point, the radium had ravaged the bodies of the women so much so that many were unable to lift their hand in court to take the oath. The Radium Girls sought $250,000 in damages. This money would be used to pay their astronomical medical bills, provide for their families, and eventually pay for their own funerals. After a year of complicated litigation, the Radium Girls had won. The USRC was instructed to pay each of the girls $10,000 plus $600 per year paid in $12 weekly increments. This was a major victory not only for the individual women, but for women's rights, worker safety, and a victory against corporate America that seemed previously unwinnable. Years later, Congress would pass a bill that specified compensation be paid to workers suffering from occupational diseases. Unfortunately, no amount of money could undo the damage done. All 5 Radium Girls would pass away from some complication brought on by their time at the United States Radium Company. Their names were Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinton McDonald, and Albina Larice. Dozens more would follow, and hundreds more would spend the rest of their lives suffering from chronic health issues. If you've watched this far, I would like to thank you for staying. If you're new to the channel and find the content interesting, you can help out by liking, leaving a comment, and subscribing. I read all the comments, so if you have a particular topic that you think would make for an interesting video, please share it below. Thanks again.